As a pastor, I'm always looking at church trends, and something that's been a trend for as long as I've been able to look into it is the American church is mostly female. Depending on where you look, what study you look at, it's about 60% female. And it's true for individual churches, it's true for the American church at large. And so I've been fascinated by the Jordan Peterson phenomenon over the last year or two, because he says, and then anecdotally it seems to be true, that his audience is about 80% male. So I thought, man, it'd be really great to ask him, hey, the American church is 60% female, your audience is 80% male. What is the church doing wrong or just not doing that could bridge that gap? Unfortunately, I had that choice recently. He was in Baltimore, and my wife and I went to the event at the Hippodrome, and during the Q&A, he selected my question to answer. And so what follows is the audio of him reading my question and then answering that. Hope you enjoy.
The American church is 60% female. Your audience is 80% male. You have a high view of Scripture. What does the church need to do, stop doing, to attract men like you? I don't think they mean men like me. I think they mean attract men like are coming to my audiences, I presume. Well, I don't know the answer to that exactly. I mean, I'd be trying to figure out what it is that I'm doing that's working. I think that one thing is that I'm trying to make a case that virtue is attained through strength and not weakness. It isn't obvious to me that the church has done a great job of manifesting that message. Perhaps there's too much emphasis on control rather than integration. That's one possibility. Maybe there's not enough of a challenge in the church's message. That's another possibility. I think I've been reasonably successful in articulating the relationship between meaning and responsibility. You know, like, that's a good one, and it's an antidote to the Peter Pan syndrome. You know, Peter Pan, he's magic, and he's magic because he's a child, and children are magic. They're magic in that they could be anything. So they have, and that's why he's Pan, Peter Pan, because Pan is the god of everything, and Pan means everything. It's not like the person who wrote that was stupid. He knew what he was doing. Peter Pan, but the problem with Peter Pan, and he's king, you know, but he's king of Neverland, and he's king of the Lost Boys, and that's not a great kingdom, but maybe it's better than no kingdom at all. And maybe it's better, maybe if you can't see a clear alternative, it's better than, it's the best you can come up with. Peter Pan has an adult male in his life, but it's Captain Hook. And Captain Hook is a tyrannical patriarch. And part of the reason for that is that he's terrified of death. Right? Now Captain Hook is missing a hand. And the reason that he's missing a hand is because the crocodile bit it off. And the crocodile, that's a very old symbol, right? That's the dragon of chaos, the crocodile. That's time itself. And that's why the crocodile has a clock in its stomach. Because Captain Hook is being chased by time, and it's already got a piece of him, and it liked the taste. And he's so terrified that it turns him into a tyrant. He's terrified and bitter, so he's a tyrant, afraid of mortality. And so that's Peter Pan's model for adulthood. And so he thinks, well, no, I'll just stay a child, king of the Lost Boys. And well, in the meantime, Wendy grows up, right? Because she's fairly sensible, or maybe driven by biological necessity to a greater degree. And she ages, of course, and she ends up married, and she has children, and Peter Pan stays a child, and he stays king of the Lost Boys, and he has to content himself with Tinkerbell, the imaginary woman who is magical but doesn't exist. And so that's not a very good bargain for him. I don't think people should stay children. I think our obsession with youth is a mistake. I don't think the best years of our life are when we're teenagers. I think that people should grow the hell up. because you have autonomy when you're an adult. And the autonomy comes at the price of the adoption of responsibility. And you might think, like Peter Pan, well, why adopt responsibility? And the answer to that is, well, you need a meaning that will sustain you in life. And the reason you need a meaning that will sustain you in life is because life is unbelievably difficult. It's an all-in game, a fatal all-in game. And there's going to be terrible storms that accompany your movement through life. And you bloody well better be resting on a firm foundation, or you won't get through the storms. And even if you do, you'll be embittered and resentful and in your own little hell. And there's nothing about that that's good. And what's the way out of that? It's like, well, pursue impulsive pleasure, be happy, inflate your self-esteem. It's like, yeah, no, none of that's going to work. Not a bit. It's counterproductive. If you're happy and something good is happening to you, fate is smiling on you, and you're happy, like, more power to you. Enjoy it while it lasts. But it's not going to last for very long. Because life is tragic, and tragedy lurks around the corner, and you need a sustaining meaning. And the truth of the matter is that the meaning that will sustain you through life is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. And the heavier responsibility you're willing to adopt, the more richly meaningful your life will be. Not only psychologically, but also practically. Because if you adopt responsibility, it means that you're striving fundamentally to fight back against suffering and malevolence. And if you do that properly, then you actually win. I mean, not completely, right? Not ever completely, but some. And so it works practically and it works psychologically. And you see, I don't think the church, I think this is what I think fundamentally, I guess, is that I think there's an idea in the Christian church that if you accept Christ as your Savior, then you're redeemed. And it's a very complicated idea. Like, you can study that idea forever and you'll never get to the bottom of it. It's insanely complicated. But the way that it's normally comprehended is that you have to say those words. And then that's that. But that doesn't exhaust the meaning of the idea. The idea is more like pick up your cross and follow me. That's the statement of belief. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the cross is a symbol, a complex and ancient symbol. It's a symbol of the centrality of the individual, because a cross is a symbol that marks the spot. And it's the central spot of being. And the central spot of being is suffering. And it's the central mark of being is suffering and subjugation to malevolence. That's why when Christ is in the desert, he encounters Satan. That's evil, that's malevolence itself, and is victorious. The idea there is that to adopt full responsibility is to confront malevolence itself and to prevail. And it's the malevolence in your own heart. Fundamentally, it's also the malevolence in other people and the malevolence in the world. It's all of that. But mostly it's in your own heart. That's the idea. And so that's the malevolence. And then the suffering is, well, the story of Christ's passion is an archetypal story. And an archetypal story is a story that cannot be magnified in some sense. So here's why. It's a story of suffering and malevolence combined. But it's a limit case story, because the story runs that the person upon whom the malevolence and suffering is perpetrated is completely innocent. And that's the ultimate tragedy, right? The ultimate tragedy is the worst possible punishment for the least deserving person. That's what makes it archetypal. And so Christ is tortured and condemned to die and betrayed by his friends and by his community. And that's as bad as it gets. You're perfectly innocent, and the worst things you can imagine happen to you. Well, and what's the story? To accept that as the price of existence and to thereby transcend it. Now that's a staggering idea. And God, can you pull that off? Well, hardly. It's too much to ask. Obviously. It's too much to ask. But there's more to people than you think. And there's more to yourself than you think. And one of the things that I've learned as a clinician is that every clinician knows this. Pseudo-clinicians don't. They're the ones who set up safe spaces on campus. Dead serious. his or her salt who thinks that the way that you make people braver is by protecting them. That is not how it works. The way you make people braver is by encouraging them to voluntarily expose themselves to those things that they are afraid of. Every clinician knows that. It's one of the, there's not that many things that clinicians of all viewpoints agree on. One is sort out your past. Another is articulate your narrative. Another is confront the things you're afraid of voluntarily. That's the pathway to psychological health, even to physical health. Well, what's the limit case to that? It's like every time you confront something you're afraid of, voluntarily, you get stronger, psychologically and practically. What's the thing you're ultimately afraid of? What if you confront that voluntarily? Who knows what that would release? Well, maybe it would release, what would it release? Well, that's what the story of Christianity, that's what the Western narrative that underlies our culture is trying to explain. That's what releases your identity with God. That's a way of looking at it. So, and the church has preserved that idea, I would say, amazingly for so many thousands of years, but doesn't seem to be able to tell it in a way that people can understand it. And my sense, and this is something I learned from reading Carl Jung, primarily, Jung believed that we had got to the point collectively in our psychological development where we could no longer be unconscious about our religious stories. We had to understand them. We had to actually understand them on an articulated level, because otherwise we'd lose them. And so I've been trying to articulate, well, this story that I just told you. I can't see any holes in it. You know, I don't know what that means metaphysically. I mean, you have to, the right way to forward through the catastrophe of life is to live honestly and nobly and to accept the vulnerability that's part and parcel of being. It's the price you pay for being. You might say, well, I don't want to pay that price. And no bloody wonder, of course you would be inclined to say that. No, but the idea that the suffering and malevolence of being is sufficient to invalidate any justification for its existence. That's a very powerful hypothesis, but I think it leads to very terrible places. That's been my assessment. You know, Goethe, the great German author, wrote a two-part play called Faust. And in Faust, someone sells his soul to the devil for full knowledge. And the devil, Mephistopheles, has a credo, and the credo is repeated twice in the play. And the play was written in two parts across decades, so the fact that it's repeated is of crucial importance. And Goethe plays roughly the same role in the Germanic literary tradition as Shakespeare does in the English, so he's a major thinker. Mephistopheles' credo is that being is so rife with catastrophe that it would be better if nothing existed. And like, man, that's a powerful argument, you know? But what I've seen when I looked into that is that when that's played out in the world, it leads to the punishment of things that exist. It leads to the punishment of being itself. It leads to hell. And so that's no solution. It's sort of like the solution of suicide. Life is so unbearable that I should bring my consciousness to an end. Well, many people think that. Some people act it out, and almost everyone thinks that now and then. But it doesn't look like a good way forward. It doesn't look like something that should be promoted and collectivized. The alternative seems to be something like the voluntary acceptance of the burden of being. And it seems to me that's... I've looked, being a relatively pessimistic person, and having looked as deeply as I could with my limited experience into the nature of suffering and human malevolence, it turned me into someone who was optimistic. And not because my appreciation for suffering and malevolence was somehow minimized. It got worse and worse as I studied the horrors, for example, of the totalitarian 20th century. I mean, no matter how terrible you think people are, they're way worse than that. And that implicates you. And no matter how much suffering you think there is, there's a lot more. And so that's pretty rough to know. And you think, well, people bring about that suffering because they're malevolent, because they're not oriented properly, and that means the structure of existence is warped in some fundamental way. And the suffering is so intense that it allows people to question the validity of their own being and of being itself. What's the antidote to that? Well, the cessation of consciousness, that's one antidote. That's maybe the fundamental motivation for the genocidal impulse. It's not the right answer. The right answer seems to be face it. Full frontal. That's the message in Rule 1, to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's not to adopt a stance of power and tyrannize the rest of humanity. It's to open yourself up to the full catastrophe of existence. And as a consequence, to find out what you could become. And I've never seen that fail. And I shouldn't say that means that if you practice it, that terrible things won't happen, because terrible things happen. But I can tell you a story about that just a little bit. One of the things that really struck me about 8 years ago, my mother-in-law, well, about 20 years ago, really, my mother-in-law developed prefrontal dementia, which is a variant of Alzheimer's disease for all intents and purposes. And she began her slow decline across about a 20-year period. And I watched her husband deal with that, and her family. And her husband's a very extroverted guy. Liked to be out, liked to be social, had a lot of friends, did his fair share of drinking. He's kind of a man about town. Everybody in the small town I grew up in knew who he was. Very funny man, loud and boisterous. But as his wife declined, he became more and more responsible for her and more responsive to her, and also unbelievably willing to accept help, which was so interesting, because the rest of us who were involved watched this happen. And we recommended at one point, for example, that he buy a big digital display that he could put in the house that would repeat a message, so that if he went out, it would just repeat where he had gone. So because she couldn't remember very well, when she could still recognize words, she would remember that. He bought that right away, and we bought a recording device that she could use in the bathroom so that she could remember how to take care of herself in the bathroom, and he implemented that right away. And so it was so interesting to watch him make these micro adjustments, some of them not so micro, at every step of the process. Sort of like his attitude was, rough as this will be, there are things I can do to make it less catastrophic than it might otherwise be. And it was really something watching him do that. And he took care of her pretty much till he couldn't lift her up out of the chair. And he was getting old too by that point. So then she ended up in a care facility. It wasn't long after that she started her final descent. And then I was around her deathbed for about a week with her kids, and my wife and her siblings and her husband. And they behaved properly. I talked to someone the other day, a terminal care physician, and I discussed this a little bit, and he said, yeah, he's seen the most terrible things around deathbeds. The family that's fragmented, resentful, full of conflict will come together around someone who's dying and take something that's already absolutely catastrophic and just turn it into hell. Well, I watched my wife and her siblings deal forthrightly with their mother's death. One sister's a pharmacist. One sister's a palliative care nurse. My wife is a massage therapist and has done some palliative work and is pretty damn robust in the face of tragedy. And they just watched her and gave her water when she needed it and dealt with each other properly. And then she died, and that wasn't so good, obviously, because they all lost their mother. But it was so interesting because it wasn't hell, so that was something, because it could have been. And then the other thing that happened is because they had all played their parts and fulfilled their responsibilities, they actually became tighter as a family. And so they lost their mother, but their relationship with her father was vastly improved, and the tightness of their bonds as siblings was amplified. And so the loss was there was a hole, but it kind of got filled by the processes that emerged as a consequence of the fact that they did this bravely and properly. And so that was one thing that made me wonder. You think, this is my rule 6, I guess, is put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. It's like, well, things are pretty bad, and now and then they're going to get a lot worse, and that's going to incline you towards bitterness and resentment and maybe the desire for revenge, and then maybe many worse things than that, because that's only the start of how terrible things can become. But you always have to ask yourself, is like, have you done everything you possibly could? Did you confront this as bravely as you could? Did you tell the truth in the situation as well as you could? Did you act in a noble and proper manner? Did you bring everything that you had to bear on the situation? And the answer to that is seldom yes. It says, well, maybe it's not the structure of reality, man. Maybe it's you. And then, that leads to another question, which is, well, there is a lot of suffering in the world. And there's a lot of malevolence. Apparently, we could do without the malevolence, because it seems to me that people could just stop acting evilly if they decided to do that. Not that that would be easy, and not that people don't have the reasons. I understand the reasons. But in principle, it's something that you don't have to do. So you might ask, well, maybe being wouldn't look so rife with catastrophe and corrupt if each of us were what we could be. And that's an optimistic question, because you could say even in your own life, it's like, I think of this with marriage. Are you 100% in? In Revelation, which is a very interesting book, Christ comes back as a judge. It's very interesting because in the Gospels he's mostly merciful, and that doesn't work out so well because the ideal is not only merciful. Any ideal is a judge. And it was Carl Jung's hypothesis that Revelation was tacked on to the end of the biblical purpose to psychologically balance the image of the perfect human being. Merciful, yes, but also judgmental, because if you have an ideal, it's a judge. Insofar as you don't live up to the ideal, it's a judge, so the judge has to make its manifestation, and so that's the hallucinogenic nightmare of Revelation, is the return of the ideal as judge, and almost everyone is found wanting. But in that strange book, Christ says something which is extraordinarily interesting. That's the metaphysical Christ, let's say. The Christ of this hallucinogenic nightmare. He says, this is a paraphrase, I saved my worst judgment not for those of you who are hot, nor for those of you who are cold, but for those of you who are lukewarm, who sit on the fence. I think, well, that's such an interesting thing psychologically. If you're all in on an error, maybe you learn. And if you're all in and you're moving in the right direction, well, maybe you're successful. But if you're hedging your bets, you're playing one side against the other, you're not risking anything, you're not betting your life on anything, you're just waiting to see how it might go, well, that's when you get shuffled off into the cohort of the damned. And I think that's right. I think it's true. Now, I don't know what it means metaphysically. Many of these things apply to life right now. And I see this is the Peter Pan problem. Again, the clients I saw that had the most pain in their lives were people who never committed. They aged without maturing. That's not a very good idea. They didn't make sacrifices. They didn't sacrifice their potential to some actuality. They didn't commit to anything. They didn't commit to a relationship, permanent relationship. They didn't commit to children. They didn't commit to a career. If they did, it was in some desultory fashion. Right? And they justified that in part by their intellectual lack of faith. It's like, it's not helpful. And so it's made me think, all that's made me think and think and think about. And I do think, who knows what you could accomplish if you were all in on the game. And, well, that's more of an answer to the question about what the churches could do to attract men. I think they have to present a sufficient challenge.